know weird accents.
No, fluent. I was in the gap. Valley Cloud quit. Started British.
See you around.
Buonasera, good evening everyone. Grazie mille, thank you so much for coming tonight to I Am Books for our first event in 2 years. The last event we held was at the beginning of March 2020, and then you all know what happened after that. We were in a different location. We are now here at 124 Salem Street. I am very excited to have tonight with us Claudia Durastanti, the author of Strangers I Know, and Professor Paola Servino of Brandeis University. I won't take up any more time. I will just introduce Chiara Durazzini, our events coordinator, who has been doing an amazing job for our online events up to now, and now also with the in-person events that we'll be doing. So thank you again for coming tonight.
Thank you, Nicola. Grazie. Welcome, everybody. We are very happy to have you all today. It's so exciting to see you in person. So today we are at the end of March, so we are closing the month that celebrates women. We started with a beautiful event online with Cristina De Stefano and her biography about Maria Montessori. And we are closing today with these wonderful guests. Let me remind you to sign up to our newsletter if you're not already. Check the website often, especially you have to go up and click events. It's kind of small.
Yes.
Click right.
I can confirm
Exactly.
that.
And check often because we are adding new events. In fact, at the end of June, we will have Carmen Marsico and her new band. She's a wonderful singer to close the season. We'll open the window and we will all sing and dance. Also, I would like for you to know that on April 8th, we are having Anne Goldstein, the translator of Elena Ferrante. However, because of health reasons, we will have to move the event from in-person to Zoom. So check out how to register, because the good side about that is that we don't have a seated limits, but you can all go on Zoom and be 200, 300, 500 attendees. So today we are having this event that is part of our series Libriamo, from Italy with Books. The series is organized in partnership with Fitch Friends of Italian Cultural Center, Boston, and is under the auspices of the Consulate General of Italy in Boston. They cannot be here. Adamo Castelnuovo, the Director of Education, was supposed to be here and give you guys a nice speech, but he's sick. So we said, stay home. We decided that's not a good idea. So with all that said, I want to introduce you, first of all, Claudia Durastanti, and I'm going to read the bio, so forgive my weird pronunciation. Sometimes I don't know how to pronounce English. Claudia Durastanti is the author of 4 critically acclaimed novels, a former Italian Fellow in Literature at the American Academy of Rome. She's a co-founder of the Italian Literature Festival in London. She graduated in Cultural Anthropology from the Sapienza University of Rome. Her work appeared in Granta, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Serving Library. She writes for several literary supplements and is on the board of the Turin Book Fair. She's the Italian translator of Joshua Cohen, Dana Haraway, Ocean Vuong, and the most recent edition of The Great Gatsby. Strangers I Know, La Straniera in Italiano, a finalist for the Premio Strega in 2019, has been translated into 21 languages. Wow. Professoressa Paola Servino is the co-chair of Italian Studies at Brandeis. Paola Servino was born in Naples, Italy, where she graduated from the Università Orientale di Napoli. She has coordinated the interdepartmental program in Italian Studies at Brandeis University since 1998. In 1998, she received the Louis Brandeis Award for Excellence in Teaching. She has led Brandeis summer travel programs in Sicily and Tuscany. She teaches courses on Italian language, culture, and literature, courses on migration from and to Italy, and Italian Jewish culture. Benvenute!
Grazie. Buonasera a tutti. Un gran piacere stasera avere Claudia Durastanti. I will go in English in a second, but I just want to prove to you that we do speak Italian as well, right? Okay. It's a wonderful pleasure for me to have Claudia Durastanti. When first I was invited to do this, I love migration stories. I love identity stories. They're very part of what I do. I teach languages. But I didn't imagine to have so much connection with Claudia's story personally and also with part of her books. So the first thing we need to say that she was really in a timely time. You know, Sunday, as you know, Coda won the winner for Best Picture, and how timely. So except for some little incident, that must have been a wonderful thing to you to see. And of course, for people that probably everybody knows, that Coda stands for Children of Deaf Adults. And this relies at the base of the core of the book, La Straniera in Italian, The Outsider, and Strangers I Know in the English translation that she's talking to you today. The important things that I think I would like to start with is just briefly mention for who hasn't read the book, because it's really important, it's really compelling, the stories. Claudia is the daughter of two deaf parents and grows up between Italy and America. Actually, and she's also the protagonist of a counter-migration story. She goes back to Italy when at the age of 6, and like she says in the book, she only comes here for one season at a time, meaning summer. So she is able to talk about this estrangement in this beautiful two worlds, the hearing words and not hearing words, but also about different geography entities, being London, or the latest place where she was, and again beginning between Basilicata and America. And there are so many themes that touch social adaptation, identity search, be estranged by friends and family members. So this book really encompasses an incredible amount of themes that are not just universal, but especially for an audience that is composed by so many Italian and Italian American. I think this is really bring us very, very close to what she's trying to do. So enough about this introduction, because you have so much to say. We're going to do a quick botta risposta, very fast. So let's start with the main topic, which I think it's very interesting. Go back to the deafness of your parents. How difficult was for you to growing up in such atmosphere, being the daughter of two deaf parents? But most important, what it meant for you to write their story, and what you were trying to say in a few words or many words.
I'll try in a few words.
Thank you.
Ciao a tutte, ciao a tutti. Thanks for being here, and thanks I Am Books and Paola for this introduction. First thing I want to say is that I didn't know I was a coda. So this book was a way to find out a sort of family investigation, but also a personal investigation to the extent that I was not raised in the community of deaf adults. And I didn't know that there was an expression even for my counter-migration, or for having been born here but not having lived here, so I was an accidental American. And so I found out through this book that there were very specific sociological categories, and the book kind of unfolded and developed as almost as an elastic experience to see how would you fit in a knowledge that label or discard it altogether. So my experience was being the daughter of a man and a woman that had a very fluid relationship with the idea of deafness. So they were not signers, they don't do sign language, And for most of her life, this is why the title of the book is La Staniera, my mother took pride in the fact that people, when she migrated from the States to southern Italy, would say, oh, where does she come from? They never said what kind of disability she has. So this ambiguity linguistically in the way she was talking, that kind of a sort of opacity around this part of her identity was very fascinating for me. So rather than, of course, there were hard times, but from a writer's point of view, which is the point of view I'm speaking from today, I think it was rather fascinating to see how you could, in a way, be flexible with something that is taught to you, that is the first thing you say to the world. Whatever thing belongs to the body, to your face, to your abilities or non-abilities, we kind of think in a mainstream way that that's the first element that comes through. And my mother proved all the time that you can be a denier, a successful denier, and a romantic imposter, even in terms of biology or what we think defines us.
And in fact, the exploration of language is very much part of your book, you know, for whatever is meant to be verbal and non-verbal communication. And the struggle that you had many moments, especially because your parents refused to teach you sign language. Did you ever resent them for that? And what it meant to you to find your own voice of communication with them? And how did you do it?
I grew up being not only a writer, but then I turned in almost accidentally in being a translator. So I developed my own personal ideas that writers, translators, but migrants, people that switch from one language to the other are sort of spies, and everybody is looking so desperately to form their own personal code. So I had a resentment, of course, but I think my mother was having this idea that she was rather polyphonic compared to being a woman who didn't have access to language. So she would use sign language with certain people. She would avoid it entirely with her family in a way, trying to test it, what was possible or not. And then she developed a very specific code with me, with her daughter. When the book came out, I met readers from all ways of life. And I remember the mother of a deaf woman who came and she said, oh, it reminded me of Canetti when he says that a mother is a language, but also language is a mother. And so with this book, I wanted to explore the family lexicon that was very much compressed into my mother and I, and explore her as if she was her own language. And maybe with other codas have a wider net, not only a support net, but they have a shared vocabulary. My experience was but I think the experience of private vocabularies, especially with family ties, belongs to everybody.
Absolutely, it is like a lessico familiare, family lexicon. The word foreigners, strangers, come with a heavy connotation of isolation, of lost and desperate search, traveling, having also issues with family. Biggest image, incredible desire of freedom, especially screamed a lot of freedom. Controversial and very exciting. And you probably have inherited some of that, I'm not sure. That at any cost, even if that means to break boundaries, was or the difficult way of expressing, but definitely of the world. Would you relate to that in a way? How can you really relate to this very element in your book?
To have a mother, for example, that would not be so obsessed with love and everything that comes with that sphere of experience. There's a passage where I say those words. And so in our theory of people don't have access to the opposite. That my mother towards that what she was margins, and the other was. So it was my mother, if she had to say, bellissima. She was into experience as abstractness when it came to understanding, because she would use it as not opposite but experience of happiness, for example. So there's a book where I openly state that my mother was more interested in meaning rather for her daughter, but very intriguing from a writer's perspective, and the way everyone chooses a basic metaphor, let's say, to on which upon. I don't know if I share it, but I did imitate my mother's quest for freedom, I think, in the realm of fiction, the structure of the book. I wanted the book to be, if not abstract, free in the way we understand time, for example, genealogical roots, understanding families not as trees, but maybe more as constellations. So I think the freedom, I inherited it in form rather than an experience in life.
And that really speaks a lot about the style of the book, that is very, very original. We can really identify in one genre specifically your book, and it's really beautiful in a way. You can read almost the chapters in different orders and still everything makes sense. At the center is this narrator, you looking for answers, looking for meaning and for languages and expression of yourself, finding your route in life. But also it's very important to see that there is pocket of narrations, very well written, followed by essay writing and social commentary. So this is already makes you extremely unique in that way. And of course, you say that this is not an autobiography, but it's some sort of like honest fiction, or I would say auto-fiction with this beautiful essay writing. And I have a question about the style particularly. Many of these topics relating with family, sometimes tragic moments, you know, about the lack of communication, the aggressiveness of some moments there can be when there is lack of communication, and so many episodes also related to your father, who was also a very complex personality, lead sometime to the possibility of basically losing a sense of language. And then, so it's so important that you use this commentary almost like this little detached ethnographic tool that you said in your book, being basically the participatory observation, which is very fascinating, that you learn with Malinowski, you know, reading Malinowski. By the way, her literacy in this book is magnificent. She basically has read almost everything that really matters in so many of these aspects. So do you think that using this register helped you to take some distance from some of these difficult topics that you treated, being like a sense of loss, of estrangement, confusion, neglect, lack of love, all of the things you said before?
One of the triggers that prompted the decision to write this book, this is my fourth book, and I carefully avoided writing about my family explicitly for most of my life, was a line by Emily Dickinson, which opens the book, is after a great pain, a formal feeling comes. I think I dealt with the great pain in my fiction, so you can always find my mother and my father concealed in my books. And when I didn't call them by their names, the tone feels more like a memoir, because my fiction about my fake father and fake mother is very visceral and is, you know, very intense. Whereas with this book, I wanted to see what would happen if I transformed them into characters and listened to them and their own aspiration to fiction. Which is funny because my parents hate fiction. One of my mother's lines is like, "Ma è una storia vera, isn't this a true story?" She would watch a film or read a book, and even films that horror films like The Exorcist, and say, "Is this a true story?" And I said, "No, it's obviously not," and she would just leave away. So I learned to lie. And in order to keep her with me, I had to pretend that everything, you know, and it was nonfiction. And my mother was right, because then nonfiction became increasingly popular in a way. And so I was not interested in the great pain. I was interested in the formal feeling. So formal sets a tone in a way that it's not necessarily colder, but a little detached and a little removed, but formal, and also about form. What form, we give to a life. How do we put our life into a novel? And so I played with this idea of a decentered I. I also call it the desaturated I. And in recent years, there's been fiction, mostly by women, that I really enjoyed, like the Outline trilogy of Rachel Cusk or Flights by Olga Tokarczuk. And you have anonymous narrators which tell the story of their life. You are able to set the puzzle and to put this kaleidoscope of a woman through the story of other people, through conversations. So was it possible in the end to play this investigation game, to have a sense of the narrator through her family, but she's not writing this account by the idea that blood, family ties are the most intimate thing you can say about yourself. I would wrap it up here, but one line that really impressed me years ago, when you see fragments and they stick in your mind, Michel Foucault said, details about my sexual life or my intimate life or sexual life are not the most intimate thing you can say about me. And to me, that was very disorientated, because the way we grow up and come of age is thinking that certain family ties. I was always intrigued by how we are affected by biology, place, landscape, or cultural upbringing in a way. So, for example, and then I'll end it here, I do think that the sense of place and landscape had a wider formative impact on me compared to the deafness, for example.
Absolutely. And in this respect, you just mentioned a very important concept that you carry throughout the book, which is the world of lies. You learn how to lie, like you just said. And there were many instances in the book where you almost, sometimes you competed with your father, who was lying the most. So it became a little bit of a game, but it was also a way of coping, I imagine. But the most important thing that you said was the beginning of this book. The beginning, as two incipit, they can go into different direction. Each of your parents claimed that they saved each other's lives. So that's already fantastic. So first of all, which is the story you want to believe the most? And what is this choice of the beginning setting the tone where the story is going? Who is going to be the good guy, the bad guy here? Who is going to be my favorite parent? That direction already was very brilliant to me, because you're going to want to know more, not of a typical plot, but the sequencing of these two adults. You talk about the world of adults is full of lies, and how that unfold in the book. So I thought that was very fascinating. Where does this beginning come from? What are you trying to send the reader to?
I was very lucky in the sense that I think my parents are the co-authors of this book, not only because they're the main characters, but they decided the form in two different points in time. So I was raised with my mother, who told me obsessively and constantly that she met this man who was trying to jump off a bridge in Trastevere in Rome. She tried to save him. He happened to be deaf. She was deaf. They spent a night together. She dumped him because she realized he was a little cuckoo, and then she left. But he found her the next day. He went to a school in Rome, and he was waiting for her outside, like this in a car. My mom always described this in a very mysterious and mystique way, but and I sucked up on that story when I was a little girl, but then I become a teenager, and I'm like, this is one, and very implausible, and two, it didn't take him such an effort to find you. There was only one school for deaf girls in Rome. He went there and you were there. So I started to mistrust this mother's myth, but it was portrayed and narrated as myth, as mythology. When I decided to start writing this book, I didn't have this opening, but then my father, I didn't grow up with him, so we never had conversations on how he met my mother. And then he said, oh, I saved her from an aggression. People was trying to rob her. What was interesting to me is the fact that they both set this action of salvation in the same neighborhood in Rome, Trastevere. And two, I thought, oh, now I'm free. I have a novel because I have a contradicted version of the same event. And so this opens up new ways. In a way, it's a poetic statement. And as I was writing the book, I did think, and I do think, that both stories are true, but that's not the founding moment of their relationship. I do think that my mother saved that guy from a bridge, and knowing my mother, I think he saved her from an aggression, but that was not the first time they met. That's something that happened in the middle of their relationship. But and the way they were narrating themselves, it was very important to set that as a foundational moment. And so to me, that's intriguing, because when we write our own mythologies, what's the entry point? What's the entry point in a life? So this book, as you said before, has chapters. I wanted them to be read in different order. I wanted, ideally, each edition to have not only, because it's like an horoscope, family, travels, health, money, and love. And ideally for me, you could start from love, and then it will completely shapeshift the sense of the book, and then you're right to family. And I wanted to play a little bit with the entry point in a life and also the exit point. And at the end, they say, we know how life ends, but how does a novel end when there's a novel about the self?
And what you just mentioned, the way you organized your book, almost following the houses of the astrology, and that's again goes back to your mom. And basically, your mother was an artist, a very eclectic human being, full of life, energy, with no boundaries at all. And she is in love with this world, this divinatory, le arti divinatorie, the oracles, cards, runes, and astrology. And clearly later in the book, you don't buy this as your own, but yet you have chosen to give some sort of homage to her by using the titles of your chapters, of your portion of the book, with the astrology. How much of this world, what that meant for you to live a world between reality and not? Because people, they usually want to go in a parallel direction, are searching for answers. And of course, she was finding her own identity as well. So how much of this world, this magic world of your mother, was interesting to you enough to at least develop a sort of intuition about life that you recognizing to be your own?
Thanks for this question. One of my favorite lines in the book is when I say that for my mother, predicting sadness was more important than avoiding it. So in a way, I always have memories of her reading tarots, but she wouldn't, it's interesting, I never thought about it. She never taught me sign language, she never read tarots to me. So that's, again, another private code she wouldn't share. And so I think I went into cultural anthropology because I was trying to make sense of how my mother, in a very deprived material context, wouldn't work, wouldn't set up a system, a life support system that was very logic, very rational. So maybe we'll get into class a little later, but the main instrument she had to cope with the surrounding reality was magic. So, and I thought it was very frustrating because we were also living in a small town in Basilicata, close. I grew up 15 minutes away from where Carlo Levi said Christ stopped in Empoli, and there's a lot in that book that was complicit with Ernesto De Martino's studies. You know, Basilicata was a dream for American anthropologists and psychiatrists like Puglia. And so I wanted to find my mother in literature, I think. And I wanted to find my mother in anthropology and sociology to make sense. But then I found that I should have belonged there too, in the sense that when you read De Martino, he speaks about the crisi della presenza. And lately, this is funny, I've been thinking how the sense of the self in the South is represented through crisi della presenza. You have Ferrante la smarginatura. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen The End of God lately. Yeah. There's a speech at the end of the film where the director goes and says to the main character, "Oh, non ti disunire." So the sense of the self in Southern culture that is quite reinforced, yes, in that way. But then we went out of fashion. I was growing up there in the 90s as a girl. I was not jumping on spiders in order, dancing a manic tarantella in order to get rid of my teenage angst. But what was the separation between those women, my mother, what kind of inheritance I had? And I think in my early work, I was doing all the best to remove the magic from it, because I thought that magic, in a very stereotypical understanding of it, would not move in line with history in a way. And I think that magic had nothing to do with technology, for example. But when you think about the internet and what it did to me, it was in many ways the highest form of magic in a way, because it was allowing me to access different version of myself through an unknown and invisible entity. And so I thought the horoscope was interesting as the setting of the book, using very banal entities. So family, love, money, everybody could find themselves in there. So horoscopes are interesting because they are the most generic and collective sense. It has to be suitable for everybody, but everybody turns it into a very personal interpretation and reading of one's own life. So this dual level of community and self was something that ended up in the book through Il Pensiero Magico.
Thank you. This is a very
And sorry, this is my favorite American author was John Didion, and I hated her for having a book called L'anno del pensiero magico, the year of magical thinking. And I think that played a little bit with me. It was interesting because through that book, which is a memoir about the passing of her husband, but the title was something that brought me back into my mother's household.
I'm glad that you were able to answer that so eloquently, like the rest of your wonderful verbal abilities. I want to go back to a little bit to the migration stories, because I think here even more many of us can really relate to. And you're talking about you went back 6 years old back to Basilicata, and basically you went back and forth just for one season, like you said in your book. And so basically you really never had the chance to belong in one place, especially America. And today is your American dream, I would say, but there's not that sense you were looking for an American dream at all, like your Italian-American relatives did find in many ways. I'm thinking about two wonderful figures like your brother, the brothers of your mother. And what I'm trying to say here is that the story of migration that you wanted to say is unique also, because you mentioned in the book something very important. You said migration stories have to either be successful or failure. They have to be having their own language that has to do about nostalgia, arrival, departures, and yet you completely break this, like observing so many of these aspects, but definitely put some irony into it, some stereotypes, but in general, also celebrating those Italian-American rituals and traditions in a very, very sensitive way. What kind of migration or maybe counter-migration stories you really wanted to tell to the audience, to your readers?
So I had a very dramatic understanding of migration when I was 6, because my mother kidnapped us and brought us from the future, New York, in the early 90s to the deep archaic past in southern Italy. And so I always thought I was in an exile, which is a very strong word and even world that you end up inhabiting. I think years ago a novel came out that I found very interesting by Mohsin Hamid. It's called Exit West. And it speaks about contemporary migration, but he has this sci-fi prop in the sense that people leave Syria and end up in Greece. You don't see the travel. They just walk out of a door. There's these mysterious doors, secret doors. You walk out the door. And so he gets rid of the main tropes of migration, which is naufragio, this odyssey of travel. And I thought it was interesting because if we take that out of the scene, the journey, the struggle, which of course it is, you would focus a little more on landing in a way. So I was disappointed with my family, my grandmother, my grandfather, for the way they landed in a way, because they were not interested in the city, for example. They moved to Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, where they already found a community of people that left from their same town in southern Italy. And I was pestering them I was really interested in becoming American. And whereas they were more, and maybe in that sense, they were more experimental and more contemporary in the way that they probably didn't believe in this binary idea, which is funny because Italian American, of course, it is a binary description, but they would be stuck in between. So my grandmother, for example, I resented her. I loved her, but I was like, you live here, you work in Midtown, you're a cook, you have colleagues. Why don't you speak English? Why don't you learn it? And she learned English. Of course, she didn't speak it. She actively decided to use it as a silent language, and then she never really fully learned Italian because she was not literate. So she would use this pidgin, this broken language, which was very common if your children are come from households of migration. And I think that the ideas that came up was about this broken language in a way that had to do with the idea of roots. So I was constantly questioned, do you feel more American or Italian? Oh, you mustn't have any roots. As this sense of belonging, which is related to an absence or lackness. I found the opposite, that I have an abundance of roots. I have excessive roots that I can pick from. And so it's interesting how the definition of the self often comes as a reverberation from the outside. When this book came out in Italy years ago, a journalist said something that never occurred to me. So Lucano-Americana, which is Basilicata American, Lucanian American. And I thought that fit because when I lived in England for many years, people would say, oh, where do you come from? And I said, it's a little complicated. Let's say I'm Italian. But then I realized, no, I'm a girl who was raised in the south of Italy and not even in a big city, in a little town. So we have multiple belongings, even if we didn't move more than 50 blocks in our whole life. So I will wrap it up this way. But I thought it was interesting, the fact that my mother, who moved from Brooklyn to this little town in Basilicata, would describe, in a very melodramatic. My mom loves opera because, of course, it's very explicit as a form of art and has subtitles. And so she would describe this trauma, this exile, this, even if she did it out of her own recklessness. And the mother of my partner, who moved from a little town in Basilicata when she got married, 10 minutes away, she moved there and she felt la straniera, the foreigner, the person in exile, or almost a refugee her whole life. So how come these two women that had a very different experience of migration on a scale were dealing with the same feelings? And so I think the fact that we think about migration often in terms of oceans and larger scales induces us to have often conservative and even repressive ideas of migration in a way, because then you think if they're doing that, they're migrants, also not immigrati in Italian, whereas if you're doing it out of cultural reason, then you're an expat. I think the factors of class, education, are involved in the conversation, and I want to debunk that in the book.
So, in fact, the next question is about social class and the confusion of growing up into different worlds economically, giving you completely different inputs and experiences. You had 70 Barbies and your brother wore Nike, but yet the upbringing, the life in Basilicata was still very modest, confused you to the point that you talk about in your book, almost like living the syndrome of the little match girl. And you didn't know where you belonged and what kind of social class you belong. When did you finally realize to give a name to your social class, that you belong somewhere and you made it some sort of evenness about all this confusion on this topic?
Yes, so maybe the most melancholic chapter in the book is the one about class, in the sense now there's a big debate on the representation of the transfuge de classe or trans class, switching from one context to the other. And so in trying to see where I was at that specific time of writing, it felt more ambiguous because I was raised not even as working class, because my mother lived on social benefits, on welfare. And I learned what I was thanks to Marxism and the left. When I met the radical left in Italy, I learned that I was not even subalterna. I was even lower than that because nobody worked in my family. So I can even, to define myself working class would be a mistake, even in that sense. But this poverty in the town was a little confusing because then we had access to the capitalist land. So we would travel, we would come back with Barbies. with Super Mario, with Nikes, and all friends would come at home. And it was, again, the way my mother recurred to depth. I thought it was interesting, and it could tell something also about my generation in a way, because we have a lot of ethnography on poverty. We have a little less ethnography on what depth as an instrument. So there was a book called Evicted. I don't remember the name, sorry, that it was an ethnographical study on the market of rent in America and how it affects Afro-American families. It was a Pulitzer Prize, I think. But he used a title of a chapter that felt my mother's life, Lobster with Coupons. So I had that kind of experience, and I felt there was a little void in the way it was portrayed in fiction in a way, because you had, especially in Italy, due to the working class history of that country and the ties with the left, you had a very specific understanding. But what if you were, I wouldn't say seduced, but what if you were switching context again, from mass culture and ideas? I think I was exposed as a child in that kind of household to the idea that you have to study a lot, you have to become successful. And the melancholy in that chapter is about the fact, what if I wanted to explore different ways? Why do we understand that in order to better to improve your station in life, you have to want more? And I think the idea of improving your station and accessing more economical resources, regardless of what that will do to other people, is something I understood pretty much later on. And I wanted to go back and discuss this idea that children of working class contexts often have to become these sort of soldiers in a way. But that's also true for children of migration in a way, that you have to learn the language properly, because then you think that you're going to have access to more resources as a citizen. So this is why I never used dialect in my books. I was very suspicious, and I think my fiction suffered a little bit of it because I was not exploring Italian to its full extent, even regional, even local, or even mistakes. I wasn't allowing myself that because I was a classic girl that went into Italian public school and said, okay, I'm going to forget all the broken language of my family and I'm going to learn Italian as it should be, which is a fiction because we all speak different Italians. Anyway.
This last thing is fascinating, to read the evolution of language in Claudia's book, from the broken dialect, the broken Italian-American language, English, Italian. You were quite confused for a while, and yet you became such a wonderful, eloquent writer and speaker in both languages, which is fantastic. And I really want to talk about the silent language in a way. And the most beautiful part, I think, for me, poetically, was you talk about your mother loving music. And I think that was really goosebump kind of moment for me, because you describe so well how interpreters during a concert are able to basically follow with their body and the movements. And so the nonverbal communication had such an important impact on your mother, to a point that you were so close to her that you learned how to read and analyze the lyrics of songs of Sanremo or even Bob Dylan before you heard them. And I thought that there was a most incredible, intimate moment between you and your mother, and in a world that you knew much better to navigate, but she completely couldn't, and yet she loved music. She could feel the vibration, and I thought that was a very poetic moment in your connection with your mother and her world.
Yeah, so when Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize, I don't know if you remember, but there was a lot of controversial conversations on the fact. And I was like, what is this all about? He was a poet for me always. And I remember when I heard him the first time, I was very disappointed because the voice could be whiny, if you're a little girl. The same happened with Patti Smith. I read her poems. My mother had a collection called Seventh Heaven, I think it's the first collection of poems. And so when I went to a record store, I was 12, and I heard Patti Smith the first time, I felt betrayed in a way. But then it was interesting because I ended up being a music journalist, and I think for a while, I always translated music, that form, into language in order to make it accessible for my mother. So in my household in America, my grandparents, my uncles, they were obsessed with a genre I don't like so much, which is Neapolitan neo-melodic music. And it was also very disturbing in the sense that I remember my grandfather making me listen to Nino D'Angelo songs, and you end up thinking that, falling in love means that a guy is going to chase you in the airport and stopping you from departing. So the first times I took a plane, I was like, oh, it's going to happen. Now nobody chased me in an airport. So that was a failure in my sentimental life. But then when I went into music, I always had this close relationship with songwriting in a way, because that allowed me to keep a closeness to my mother. I received death threats lately because I reviewed an Italian band called Maneskin. I don't know if you're aware.
Popular right now.
So I said, the person that understands them better is my mother, and she's deaf. She likes them. And I said, oh, that's insulting to the band and to your mother. But what I wanted to say, of course, in music, another language is the performative language, where it not necessarily has to do with sound. This is why I was so obsessed with punk as a girl. My mother would understand what punk was, even if she couldn't listen. Exactly. And so the kind of relationship between music and subcultures. The first real betrayal, I think, was when I started slowly getting into experimental ambient music. How do you translate that? And that was a surprising journey in the sense that there's vibration more and more. There are tech devices that allow you to feel music in your body. So if I took my mother to, My Bloody Valentine concert, which is the highest experience of noise possible, there maybe could be a moment where why I was feeling and she was feeling could be similar in a way. Not or different in the sense of when we all go to a concert, we have, a common experience, but individual and private meanings of it. And so with the book, it was interesting to play also with this idea of subtitles in music. My mother loves to watch Sanremo, and I watched it with her a long time. And then she would always pick the song that had a higher songwriting skills or even a sociological meaning. So if the song was very political, my mother would say, oh, this is the best song. And I would instead pay a lot of attention to the sound of it. And so in a way, I was judging the best song and she was judging the best short story in that context of Sanremo. But what was funny was realizing what the subtitles are. So for example, when you have songs on display, they would have subtitles and there was an instrumental part and they would put the notes. There was no effort to describe if the rhythm was happy or sad or slow.
You're suggesting colors.
Exactly. And so I discovered that in the Japanese subtitle culture, I think also Chinese one, I've seen very brief videos and formats, they have a different way to outline subtitles. So they use color, they use different rhythm of when the words surface, they disappear, they don't necessarily have to be horizontal, they can be vertical, they can pop up on the screen in a different way. This is why I said I want an army of language poets or surrealist poets to do subtitles. And it's also funny when you think about that in films, especially when there's a silence and there's a subtitle that comes up saying silence. What does that mean for a deaf person who's interpreting that silence? And so there was a part in the book where I worked on that through the essay form rather than the fictional one.
And I think we're going to go to just two brief last questions. One is about the title. In Italian, you say La straniera, the outsider, sorry. And that, of course, echoes Camus, that you also brilliantly refer to in the book. And it's a female, feminine singular word. But it was translated 3 years after The Strangers, I know. And in a way, I can think of the title in English of more inclusive of otherness than the original title. Is there any passage that you had to do in order not to call La Straniera, the outsider, again, like other people have, but in English, but in Italian stands pretty well. What was this change of the title from singular to your parents, really, or to more people?
Yeah, it was a long journey, but then my editor Laura Percesepe, she, at one point, she had the idea to leave it to La Straniera because she was worried about losing the gender element. And then I had an even more societal idea, which was suggesting to the publisher in different languages to have the word La Straniera in a different language. So l'étranger in the English edition, l'extranera in the Dutch edition, and they said, no, it's a fascinating idea, but I wanted to play with this kind of meta level of the word foreigner. And so there was a loss, of course, in the sense that La Straniera, all the activators, that's the way I call them, of migration in this book are women. So as my great-grandmother, grandmother, my mother, and then I narrated that. And so, of course, there's also a reflection on female writing. So I think, but that loss was counterbalanced by this plurality, sorry, in the sense that it's not just a mother-daughter relationship in the book. There is also a family, but there's chapters like the one in London where I am writing in first person, singular, but I'm thinking, and there's a hidden first person plural. I'm really saying we live in this context. And also it was interesting because one of the triggers, again, was a reaction to L'étranger, The Outsider, The Stranger by Albert Camus. I loved the book, but in a way, the experience of exile, alienation, foreignness felt very legitimate in the sense that you had the background of European literature that would hold it up in a way. When he was writing that book, he had all of the ghosts of European literature behind himself. And when I experienced migration in London during the Brexit years, I felt that there was not, we didn't have right to such a strong portrait in fiction of our sense of alienation in a way. So I think Strangers I Know helps a little bit with that in enlarging the context and really saying who are the main characters, who are the minor characters, do they switch role on stage? So I like the idea that my mother is just making rounds and other people come and disappear at the same time.
And it's also interesting you mentioned Camus again, because Marceau, the character in his book, is definitely much more indifferent than you are to your own stories, and you're completely two different people in that way. So that's also fascinating to make the comparison.
And
so
he kills his mother, and I was not able to do that in this book.
Okay.
Yeah. In a way, like
that's a very
metaphorically. Yeah.
Absolutely. And before we move to your questions, I would like to just close with a very simple question. If you could bring one sound into your mother and father world, what would that be?
That's a beautiful question. And I think it would be the sound of my voice. This is what my mom always says. I am surrounded by these annoying people all the time. And I don't know the sound of my daughter, which is, no, it's not entirely true in the sense that my mother is not like my father. She lost her hearing through meningitis. And so she had it for a while. It would come and go, which was a very scary experience. So I would be real in my voice for my mother and very intermittent experiences, and she would never know where she would find this, in sound, and when she would not. And so we had to, when it happened, it was kind of a family shock. Thanks for reminding me that me and my brother were like, oh, she did hear. And sometimes we would be disappointed because maybe we were doing something that we were not supposed to do. But then my mother turned into being completely deaf. So it would be maybe a memory for her to.
It was not a selective moment that she could operate.
No, it would come and go. So you had to, take advantage of the window. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Claudia.
Thank you.
This is really fascinating to listen to. Would you like to ask some questions? It's your, please. I would love to hear more from the audience. Otherwise, I can go for another 5 hours. You don't want to have more questions. Anybody? Yes.
Just ask you how the book itself has migrated from Italy to the U.S. I mean, have you noticed any differences in reception from La Straniera, which obviously was listed as a finalist for Strega, and then Strangers I Know you've been doing this great tour throughout the U.S. and talking to groups like this. So Yeah, what's that experience been like, and is it different in any way with respect to your experience in Italy?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I would enlarge the context in the sense that this book was translated in different languages. So what was surprising to me was to see how in a specific culture and language some aspects would be very visible and come to the surface and discussed in public events, and some of them would be completely disappear. So in Germany, lots of the conversations on the politics of gender and disability. And it was interesting also, there was the first time that they have such a strong deaf community that, of course, I'm writing from the perspective of a daughter, but then a newspaper wrote, oh, there's no love between deaf, which is something my mother says. She's not speaking for all of the deaf people. But then I got contacted by activists in the deaf community that were, in a way, obviously concerned about how deaf culture came across his book. And so we had a conversation there. And France, a lot of interest, no interested in the family saga at all. At the beginning, they were even convinced they didn't want to buy it because they liked only the 2 final chapters, which are more conventionally autofiction, where I speak about my intimate life, my love life, and money, a lot of conversations on class. In the US, I must say that the migration is the main focus. And of course, I think it's related to the fact that people came from somewhere else. And I was in California a while ago, and I translated a book about the migration and language and mother, the relationship with the mother, by Ocean Vuong, called On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Which is interesting because in the book, he studies Italian-American studies at one point, and he reads and he mentions Cristo tra I muratori di Pietro di Donato, which is a very specific reference. And then I met scholars and students that says that it's interesting how the experience of Italian-American migration through fiction right now is actively studied by 3rd, 4th generations of other communities, which is something from Italy that I didn't think of. So it was interesting to me to see that rather than speaking only to the very specific Italian-American migration, it comes from understanding Italian-American migration almost as a literary object into itself, a fiction into
it is changing. It's
itself.
a wonderful field of studies at the moment in my university.
Very.
Really an expansion, and not just Italian Americans are interested. Actually, it's like American students, they understand. They're related to so much of the Italian culture here. So it's really a wonderful expansion field.
Yeah, but I would say that that's the main switch here.
What was the focus in Italy? What did people focus on?
The weirdness of my family, I might say. Never questions deafness. Very few. Of course, I mean, this is a stereotype, but I wrote a book about a mother. If you analyze contemporary Italian fiction, this is why in my new book I have a character of a satire called Mother, and she's not the mother of anyone, So I remember that when I went to the tour, this book in Italy, at one point I said, and my mother didn't have any kids, which is a paradox, but it is in a way to say that the way I treated her, I was trying to imagine her independent from me. In a way, and so this is why maybe influenced the tone of the saturated I was saying before. So in Italy, the obsession was with how the family saga is changing, and there was a novel that is coming out in English now by, I called it a novel, it's a hybrid book by Marta Barone, called Città Sommersa, Sunken City. Is very interesting because it also has a method of oral history. Her father was a doctor who was confused for a terrorist in a minor group of the Italian radical left. So she's telling the story, the father passed away, of her father as an investigation, but she's using traces and pieces of history and memories of that generation. And I thought the blend was super interesting. So someone is actively trying to break family, but I would say that the main focus there was all on the mother. Yeah.
Any other question? What is your take of Elena Ferrante? What you coming both from an idea of South that's totally different. I personally am from Naples, and I must tell you, I do not always appreciate the intensity of bringing so much down, that kind of scorciolita napoletano, you know, these little moments of depressive, and just monolithic way of thinking of poverty. Your way of talking about poverty and modesty and family sagas is much more vibrant and ironic, and I just like to know what you thought about her books.
This is a very charged question
I know.
in the sense that I believe writers can write about anything. So I don't think that you should have grown into an experience, be necessarily intimate with that experience in order to give a faithful account. I must say that in Italian fiction, again, the portrait of the working class was usually from a dominant perspective. So it was often the most tragic, you know, it's part of Italian cinema is built after the war on this kind of feeling. Very beautiful films often, but with this sense of the darkest tragedy, and it goes over and over and over. And when I see that, I disconnect. So Ferrante came was into my life in a funny way. I read her in English first, and I read her in translation. But this has happened to me also with other authors, Italian authors, and unfortunately women, because they are not thought very well in school. So when this book came out, Ginsburg was an obvious reference to you. I reread Natalia Ginsburg, which is massive in the States today. It's funny how I meet friends and they ask me, this happened months ago, are you a Ginsburg person? And I'm like, how this is turned into a question.
You have to choose.
And I'm kind of happy that when you speak about Italian literature in the States years before, it was impossible to do so without Italo Calvino, Pasolini, Morante, and Moravia. Right now, at least in the past year, I would say the first names that come up are my favorite Italian author was Cesare Pavese, who's not considered not to be Italian enough, and he was obsessed with America, and Natalia Ginsburg. But going back to Ferrante, I think that I became aware that that's the book of a translator. So I'm not trying to dwell into, in many ways, it is the
cultural translator as well, in many ways.
In many ways, the way they, who worked on Naples and landscape, I think it had a perspective of translation that was embedded in the writing. Even maybe unconsciously, but it's the way the materials from the geography, the archetypes, the relationship between genders are selected, are through a perspective of multicultural, multilinguistical translation. So it's impossible to speak about that for me without seeing it in an international context rather than specific, which I don't know if this makes sense for you, but it's like reading the city, for example, reading the neighborhood, reading the relationship between men and women, reading misogyny or factory culture or politics through that lens.
That's absolutely a great part.
Which is not necessarily, I think, has to do with the exotic in a way, but it has to do with how does this become such a porous and fluid material that it can travel in many, many, many languages, which is
translation is an incredible skill and tool to also read with a certain objectivity or not, and definitely the Ferrante has that in a way there is no so much.
If you were publishing, sorry if I interrupt you, it's not that at one point they were submitting novels and saying, oh, this Italian women is like Ferrante. No, it's post-Ferrante. You have submissions, my friends or agents that were saying from the Philippines or from so the local Ferrante, it became good reasons, bad reasons. It became, I think, that kind of portal that has translation embedded into it. So I think that's my main frame. I enjoy some aspects of it. I enjoy lesser aspects of it, but I do read it with that. Yeah.
Great, please.
But are you also suggesting that the person who wrote the Ferrante novels was translating Neapolitan culture in the sense that she is not a Neapolitan herself. She is from outside, viewing, explaining, whatever, creating.
This is an interesting question. So it's an example. Years ago, you had in urban neomelodical music the case of another anonymous producer called Liberato. He was drawing from the tradition from neomelodical music and making some linguistic experiments. He was favored at the beginning by this very aesthetical and highly visual videos with the song, and it was traumatic for the community of neomelodic music. And there was this idea of colonialism in the sense that it appealed to a lot of kids in Milan, in urban cities, in urban contexts, and they were like, oh, this is, he's not Neapolitan, she's not Neapolitan, this is done for the outsiders. I think it's more complicated than that, in the sense that we all have, to a certain extent, an intimacy. We can say the most stereotypical things of a city we live in. We decide to show, somebody comes, you pick, you make your own tour guide, or where I'm taking this person. Am I going, and I'm very suspicious of the idea of authenticity. That's something that is made and constantly made. And sometimes we have pockets of foreignness in a way. And I do think that Ferrante sometimes, surprisingly, hits those pockets of foreignness, and sometimes she's instead relying on stereotype. But when I was describing my Italian-American family in this book, I was so nervous that they would watch The Godfather with that kind of obsession. Like, well, why is this happening? And that was a family movie for me, a film, not Christmas film, but I saw it when I was 4, in a way. And so when I went to cultural anthropology, my professor, the first thing she said, oh, that's highly disrespectful against the South, this idea of the South. So at one point there was this counter narrative that the South had to be freed and reclaimed by crime, fictionalities, or stereotypes. And I think not the right answer, but it does stand in between, in the sense that if you want to so desperately avoid stereotype, then you are entering a very dangerous zone in a way, which could be beautifully liberating, but sometimes it wouldn't appeal or have a response in a way. It can turn into utopia or dystopia so easily. Right. So I think Ferrante, as other talented authors from the South right now, are trying to find their own zone in between counter authenticity and stereotype.
But there's also
sorry, I said that because I think Liberato too was trying to translate melodical sound.
And it's almost like some of these writers are expected to perform that way, are expected to go on these topics and go in a certain direction. So it's also very interesting, there is it's almost like what the public want to hear about certain conditions, certain stereotypes.
Yeah, but sometimes there's also an instrumental playfulness into that. So this conversation started with the idea of how, stranger could be a beautiful word if you reclaim it for yourself. It can be also a very violent word. It comes from the outside. So I'm the daughter of a woman who had a very difficult relationship with the idea of deafness and being labeled as a deaf woman. And so sometimes when we were kids, she would protest, and we would say, oh, you want to do it? You can do it. And she said, I'm like you. I'm normal like you. I can do this. And sometimes, okay, you do this by yourself. You go to the school and you speak by yourself. You will do this by yourself. No, I'm a deaf woman. I can't. So this instrumental playfulness, ambiguity, it's not a tool only of the dominant. What upsets me about the contemporary discourse is this idea that switching identities is a privilege, but it's something that in a very material and basic way is done into minorities all the time. So identity is not just a game that it is something that it's complex in the sense that it is something you activate and something you have the right to forget about. So I think that plays into the writing of the margins, which is something that Ferrante has done a lot.
As marginatura.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Anybody else would like to ask a question? Eleni.
Thank you so much. I just want to make an observation, because something you said about Albert Camus triggered this whole thought around the title of the book, which I had not thought of at all. The mother of Albert Camus was deaf. Did you know that?
No, this is like
Wow.
a shocker to me.
Madame Camus was a deaf woman, and and he's my favorite writer, so pardon my emotionality. And Camus, Albert Camus, lost his father in the First World War. She was expecting a baby. She had a son already, and then Albert came, so he was born an orphan from a very, very poor family, French family, born in Algiers, in Algeria. And she was mute. So I just wanted to tell
I
you.
know that. I'm
Fascinating.
kind of,
Yes, you
kind
have
of
a
shocked,
reading.
yes.
to the stories.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you everybody so much.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you.
So we have Claudia's books available both in English and Italian, and Claudia's available for Spanish.
It is a must read, believe